Listen, can you hear it? Beneath the city of light, beneath the bustling cafes and the wide tree-lined boulevards, there is another Paris, a city of silence, of eternal night. And if you listen very, very closely, past the drip of water, past the sigh of the earth, you can hear them, the whispers. They don't speak in words, not really. It's a feeling, a chill that isn't from the damp air, a sense of a presence just over your shoulder, in the corner of your eye that remains stubbornly, terrifyingly empty. This is the story not of the dead, but of what happened when the dead were disturbed, when 6 million souls were evicted from their graves and stacked like firewood in the dark. This is the story of the bone whisperers of the Paris catacombs. Our story begins not in the darkness, but in the blinding, suffocating stench of the sun. Paris, 1780, the year the dead finally declared war on the living. Imagine the parish of Les Innocents, the city's oldest and most overcrowded cemetery. For centuries, it had served as the final resting place for generations of Parisians. But by the late 18th century, it was less a sacred ground and more a festering wound in the heart of the city. The ground, saturated with decomposing matter, rose 30 feet above the surrounding streets. Mass graves known as charniers were piled high, often left open to the elements. The air was thick with the smell of mephitis, the foul gas of decay. It was a smell that clung to your clothes, your hair, the back of your throat. It was a smell that could kill. We have the account of a police lieutenant tasked with investigating a complaint from the residents living in the shadow of Les Innocents. He describes a cellar on the Rue de la Lingerie, a stone's throw from the cemetery walls. The wall of this cellar, constantly damp from the saturated earth, was no longer made of stone and mortar. It had become a porous membrane, oozing a thick, black, putrid liquid. The inhabitants of that house, they didn't just smell the dead, they lived inside a tomb. They suffered from constant, racking coughs, from fevers that stole their breath. They claimed the very air was poison, and they were right. The final straw came in the spring of 1780. A particularly violent downpour, combined with the pressure from a mass grave against a cellar wall on a property bordering the cemetery, caused a catastrophic collapse. The earth gave way and the contents of the charnier, the bones, the rot, the unspeakable decay, burst forth into the basement of the home, flooding it with a tide of death. The city could no longer look away. The dead were literally breaking down the doors. The solution was as radical as it was macabre. For years, inspectors had been exploring the anciennes carrières, the ancient limestone quarries that snaked for hundreds of miles beneath the city. These were hollow, forgotten spaces, a mirror image of the streets above. The King's Council issued a decree on November 9, 1785. The cemeteries of Paris would be evacuated. The bones would be transferred to the quarries, consecrated and sealed. It was the largest, most unsettling urban renewal project in human history, and it was entrusted to a man named Charles Axel Guillemot, the Inspector General of Quarries. Guillemot was an architect, an engineer, a man of reason and order. To him, this was a logistical puzzle, a public works project of monumental scale. He didn't see ghosts, he saw structural integrity, load-bearing walls, and efficient transport. He and his team of quarrymen reinforced the crumbling tunnels, creating a vast subterranean necropolis. They built access shafts, and every night, under the cover of darkness to avoid causing a panic, a somber procession began. Black-draped wagons, accompanied by chanting priests, would carry the exhumed remains from the cemeteries to a newly opened shaft. The bones were not carefully sorted. They were dumped down the shaft into a chaotic pile of history. A duke's femur resting against a beggar's rib, a nun's skull staring blankly at a soldier's jawbone. For years, this was the process. Dump and forget. It was a practical solution, but it was not a respectful one. It was an act of architectural necessity, not spiritual grace. And it is here, in this initial period of chaotic displacement, that the first whispers began. The workers, the catacombes, were a hardened lot. They spent their lives in the dark, their faces pale, their lungs filled with stone dust. They were not prone to fancy. But stories started to trickle up to the surface, told in hushed tones in dimly lit taverns after a few glasses of cheap wine. They spoke of things seen from the corner of the eye, a shadow that darted behind a pillar just beyond the circle of lantern light, a breath of cold air in a tunnel with no draft. And the sounds. The sounds. Not just the settling of bones, they said. That was a sound you knew. This was different. One older worker, a man named Philippe with hands like granite and a missing front tooth from a tunnel collapse, claimed he was working alone, reinforcing a pillar deep in a newly consecrated section. He heard it clearly just over his shoulder. Not a moan, not a groan, a whisper. A sibilant, rushing sound like dried leaves skittering across stone, but with an intelligence behind it. It didn't form words, he said, but it carried emotion, a profound, bottomless sense of loss. He dropped his hammer and ran, not stopping until he saw the daylight of the entrance shaft, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Then, in 1786, the project gained a new director, a man with a very different vision, Ricard de Toury. He saw the chaotic bone pits not just as a dump, but as a monument, a place that should inspire reflection, even macabre beauty. Under his direction, the haphazard piles of skeletons were transformed. Skulls and tibias were arranged in elaborate, almost decorative patterns. Walls of bones, punctuated by rows of skulls, became features. Columns were built from femurs, and altars were constructed, adorned with carved verses about the inevitability of death. It was during this period of artistic rearrangement that the phenomena intensified. It was as if by organizing the dead, by creating a mockery of a city for them, their presence became more focused, more coherent. The workers, now handling each bone, placing each skull with deliberate intent, became the primary witnesses. They were the ones who spent 10, 12 hours a day in the company of 6 million silent companions. Jean, a young laborer from the countryside, was tasked with stacking tibias. He was a skeptic, laughing at old Philippe's stories, but one afternoon, as he reached for a bone from the supply cart, he felt a resistance. He looked down. The bone, a long, pale femur, was cold, colder than the surrounding air. As he pulled, he swore he felt a corresponding pull from the other end. Not a physical weight, but a tension. He let go, startled. The bone clattered back onto the pile. And from the darkness behind the cart, he heard it. A soft, wet sigh. The sound a man might make with a punctured lung. Jean never laughed at the stories again. But the most chilling accounts came from the guards. After the ossuary was officially consecrated and opened for limited visits, a small contingent of watchmen was stationed at the entrances. Their job was solitude and silence. One, a former soldier named Lefebvre, kept a journal, now housed in the archives of the Carnavalet Museum. He wrote of footsteps that echoed his own, but a half step out of sync. He described the feeling of being watched by 1,000 empty eyes, a sensation so overwhelming he would sometimes have to turn his back to the bone walls to catch his breath. His most harrowing entry is dated February 12, 1793. The revolution was raging on the surface, the guillotine was busy, and the catacombs were receiving a new, fresh wave of the dead from the Place de la Révolution. Lefebvre wrote of a night when the whispers became a chorus. Not loud, but pervasive, filling the tunnels like a subterranean river. He described it as a murmuration of discontent, a sound of countless voices, each lost, each confused, each angry at their displacement. He claimed he saw them then, not bodies, not ghosts, but moving patches of a deeper darkness within the dark, swirling and coalescing in the tunnels ahead of him, retreating as he advanced with his trembling lantern. He wrote, "It is not one spirit we have angered,
It is a nation of the dead, and they are learning to speak with one voice.
This idea, this collective unrest, took root. The catacombs were not haunted by individual ghosts, but by a single, vast entity formed from the mingled memories and suffering of millions. A psychic residue given form by the sheer density of death. The folklore of Paris adopted. Parents warned disobedient children that the bone men would come for them. Lovers who dared to sneak into the tunnels for a thrill reported feeling a cold, jealous hatred emanating from the walls, as if the lonely dead resented their warmth, their life, their beating hearts. The 19th century saw the catacombs become a dark tourist attraction. Writers, poets, and aristocrats would descend on tours, seeking a frisson of terror. But even they were not immune. The acclaimed writer Victor Hugo, who drew inspiration from the tunnels for Les Miserables, noted an oppressive intelligence in the air. Another visitor, an English lord, wrote to his family that his guided tour was cut short when the entire party simultaneously heard a distinct single word whispered directly into their ears. The word was départ, leave. The guide, pale as the skulls around them, simply said, "They are restless tonight," and hurried them back to the surface. What is the truth behind the bone whispers? Were the workers and guards immersed in an environment of profound psychological stress, simply succumbing to a form of collective hysteria? The human mind is not designed to process such a landscape of death. The sheer scale of it can warp perception, turning the drip of water into a sigh, the flicker of a lamp into a moving shadow. Or did the act of moving these millions, of tearing them from their designated sanctified ground and stacking them like cordwood in a cold, dark, artificial city, create a spiritual trauma of such magnitude that it left a scar on the very fabric of the place? A place where the barrier between the living and the dead became thin and porous, where the silent, collective memory of 6 million souls, their lives, their loves, their suffering, began to echo through the stone, a low, resonant frequency of unrest that the sensitive, the lonely, or the terrified could sometimes, just sometimes, hear. The Paris catacombs remain to this day. A small section is open to the public, but the vast majority of those 200 miles of tunnels are forbidden. The Port Mahon Gallery, the Russian bunker, the rooms with their beautiful, terrible artwork of bone are all off limits. And yet, people still sneak in, the so-called cataphiles. And their stories continue, of cameras failing, of voices recorded on otherwise empty audio tracks, of a feeling of being herded, pushed away from certain areas by an unseen, unfriendly presence. So the next time you walk the sun-drenched streets of Paris, remember the city beneath your feet. Remember the great, silent weight of history in bone, and know that silence is not always empty. Sometimes it is simply waiting, listening, and whispering back.
Imagine the weight of a silence. Not a peaceful silence, but a heavy, waiting silence. The silence of a cradle that no longer rocks. The silence of a small room where the only sound is the ragged breath of a mother praying to a God who does not seem to listen. This is the silence that settled over the villages of the Black Forest in the long, dark years of the 18th and 19th centuries. A silence born from a terrifyingly common tragedy. And in the face of such unbearable loss, the human mind does what it must. It conjures a monster. Because sometimes it is easier to believe your child was stolen by a fiend than to accept that they were simply taken by the cold. Our story begins in a place like 1,000 others, a small farming village clinging to the edge of the wilderness. Here, in 1782, lived a carpenter named Klaus and his wife, Anya. Their world was one of rough-hewn timber, of soil that yielded its bounty only through back-breaking labor, and of a faith so intertwined with older, darker beliefs that the line between prayer and superstition was blurred beyond recognition. Their pride and joy was their son, Matthias, a boy of 3 with hair the color of wheat, and the laugh that, his mother would later swear, could make the fire in the hearth burn brighter. But one morning in late autumn, that laugh was gone. Matthias did not wake with his usual chatter. He was listless, his skin pale and waxy. He would not eat the broth Anya desperately spooned towards his lips. His eyes, once bright with curiosity, were dull and distant, seeming to look at something in the far corner of the room that his parents could not see.
Klaus, look at his eyes. They are not his eyes.
Klaus, a practical man whose world was built with solid wood and sturdy nails, dismissed it at first. It is a fever, woman. He will be well by Sunday. But Sunday came, and Matthias was worse. He had begun to make a sound, a low, guttural humming that was entirely alien. The village midwife, old Marta, was summoned. Her hands, gnarled like the roots of the forest, traced the boy's fevered brow. She peered into his vacant eyes, and her own filled with a dread that had nothing to do with medicine.
The child, he is cold. Colder than the fever should make him. His appetite is gone for our food. He does not respond to his mother's voice. Klaus, this is not your son. The word hung in the smoky air of the cottage, unspoken but understood. Wechselraum, changeling. It was an ancient belief, a piece of folklore as old as the hills themselves. The idea that malicious forest spirits, the kobolds or the Erl King, would covet a human child for its beauty or its vitality. They would sneak into a home and with a breath of magic swap the healthy infant for one of their own sickly, ancient kin. The thing left in the cradle looked like your child, but it was a hollow, wasting copy. A cruel, parasitic imitation that would slowly fade and die, draining the life and happiness from the household. And why? As a mockery of humanity, as a sick game for creatures of the deep wood. For Anya, the theory was a perverse comfort. It meant her real son, her bright Matthias, was still alive. He was out there, in the vast, impenetrable green of the Black Forest, perhaps being raised by the fair folk in a hollow hill. It was a nightmare, but a nightmare with hope. The alternative, that this wasting, silent child was truly her boy, claimed by some mundane, inexplicable illness, was a despair too profound to bear.
But the folklore provided more than just an explanation. It provided remedies, desperate remedies. Klaus, his heart hardening with a grim resolve, took the advice of the village elders. One evening, as the thing that looked like Matthias lay listless in its cot, Klaus began to brew a pot of coffee, but this was no ordinary coffee. He made it with bitter, acrid grounds, boiling it until the steam filled the cottage with a pungent, choking smell. The old tales said a changeling, being an ancient creature, would be shocked by the intensity of such a modern concoction. It would sit up and speak with the voice of an old man, revealing its true nature. Klaus held the steaming cup near the child's face. The boy, the thing, stirred. Its eyes fluttered open, and for a moment Klaus's heart leapt. But then it let out a thin, reedy wail, a sound of pure distress that held no words, only terror. Anya rushed from the other room, her face a mask of horror, and shoved the cup away, scalding liquid splattering across the dirt floor. "Stop it! You are hurting him! Can you not see you are hurting him?" The coffee had failed. The next test was more brutal. Old Marta advised them to take the child to the edge of the woods to a specific lightning-blasted oak tree said to be a gateway to the other world. They were to lay the child at its roots and turn their backs, walking away without a single glance. If it was a changeling, the true parents would come to reclaim their own, and in their shame return the human child. The following dusk, a small, solemn procession left the village. Klaus, carrying a bundled, silent Matthias, Anya, her face pale and streaked with silent tears, and a few of the stern-faced elders carrying torches that fought back the encroaching gloom. The forest seemed to watch them, a wall of silent, judging sentinels. They reached the scorched oak, its branches like skeletal claws against the twilight sky. Klaus, his hands shaking, laid the small warm bundle amongst the thick gnarled roots. "Take your thing. Give me back my son." They turned. They walked back towards the distant, flickering lights of the village. And with every step, Anya felt a piece of her soul being torn away. The sound that escaped her lips was not a sob, but a low, animal keen of agony. They waited all night in their cottage, listening for a cry, for a familiar small knock at the door. The only sound was the wind, whistling through the cracks in the timber, sounding like a child's lonely cry. At first light, Klaus ran back to the oak. The bundle was still there. The child was still breathing, its chest rising and falling in shallow, fragile breaths. It was colder now, and its humming had stopped, replaced by a profound, unnerving silence. He had been abandoned by the human world, and now, it seemed, by the fairy world as well. He picked up his son, for what else could he do, and carried the limp, chilling form back home. This was the terrible crossroads where folklore curdled into true horror. If the gentle methods of exposure and trickery failed, the old stories whispered of a final, dreadful solution. To force the supernatural hand, one had to threaten the changeling. To make the household so inhospitable, so terrifying, that the fiendish parents would have no choice but to return and reclaim their own. This is where the shadow of the Kinderfresser, the child eater, begins to fall across our story. For some, the Kinderfresser was not a separate entity, but a role a desperate parent was forced to play. The belief was that if you threatened the changeling with utter annihilation, the true child would be saved.
We have records chilling in their bureaucratic dryness from church ledgers and town council minutes from the 1740s in Württemberg, not far from the Black Forest. An inquest into the death of a child where the parents testified they had placed the changeling on a hot shovel to make it speak. Another case from 1802 in Bavaria, where a woman was tried for neglect after following a cunning man's advice to leave a sickly infant out in the freezing rain to break the fairy's spell. In the cottage, despair had frozen into a grim shared resolve. Anya, who had once defended the child from the coffee, now looked at it with hollow eyes. This was not her Matthias. This thing had stolen her son's face. It had to be shunned. It had to be made to leave. On the advice of the elders, they built the fire in the hearth higher than it had been, until the stones of the fireplace glowed with heat. The air in the cottage shimmered. Klaus took the heavy, iron-fired shovel used for baking bread and held it in the flames until the metal glowed a dull, angry red. The thing in the cradle began to stir, as if sensing the shift in intention. It let out a mewling sound, a pathetic, weak noise. "Give me back my son. Give me back my son." He did not intend to touch the child with it. The folklore was clear. The threat was the key. The performance of violence was meant to summon the hidden audience. He was acting out the part of the ultimate monster, the Kinderfresser, to scare the real monsters. He drew the glowing shovel from the fire, its heat washing over the room. He took a step towards the cradle. And in that moment, the child's eyes, Matthias's eyes, snapped open. They were no longer vacant. They were wide with a primal, understanding terror. It saw the glowing iron. It saw the face of the man it called father, twisted by fear and rage into something unrecognizable. It let out a single, piercing, perfectly human shriek of utter fear. And from the forest, just outside the window, came an answering sound. Not a shriek, but a deep, guttural, grinding roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cottage. It was a sound that belonged to no wolf, no bear, no natural beast of the wood. It was a sound of ancient, predatory hunger. Klaus froze, the shovel dropping from his nerveless fingers, clattering on the stone hearth. Anya screamed, clutching at her husband. The sound from the forest faded, leaving a silence more profound and more terrifying than any that had come before. The child in the cradle was now silent again, but its eyes were fixed on the window, a faint, knowing smile on its pale lips. The line between the monster you perform and the monster that answers is a thin one. And in the deep, dark woods of the human heart and of the Black Forest, sometimes that line vanishes altogether. The next morning, the child was dead. The village preacher wrote in the parish ledger, "Matthias, son of Klaus the carpenter, taken by a sudden fever. God have mercy on his soul." There was no mention of glowing shovels, of guttural roars from the forest. The official record is always sane, always clean. It is the stories whispered by the fire that hold the messy, terrible truth. The story of Klaus and Anya is a composite, but it is built from 1,000 real tragedies. The changeling myth was a cultural coping mechanism, a narrative framework imposed on the terrifying randomness of disease and death. In an era before germ theory, when conditions like failure to thrive, cerebral palsy, cystic fibrosis, or a dozen other childhood illnesses were utterly incomprehensible, the changeling offered a reason, a villain. And the Kinderfresser? He is the ultimate embodiment of that villain. But he is also the dark mirror of that desperation. He is the story that says, your child is not dead, he is stolen. And he is the story that says, to get him back, you must be willing to become a monster yourself. The fiends in the forest were real. They were the hunger, the poverty, the bacteria, the unshakable grief. But by giving them a name and a form, our ancestors believed they could be fought. They could be outwitted. They could be appeased. The silent children of the Black Forest were victims twice over. First, of the harsh realities of 18th and 19th century life, and second, of the terrifying, beautiful, and sometimes brutal stories we tell to make sense of a world that often makes no sense at all. The woods are quieter now. The cradles are, for most, safer. But the silence they fear today is a different one. And the monsters have simply learned to wear new faces.
Imagine a place where the memory of gold was so powerful it could build a town from nothing. A place where the hope for a better life was so intoxicating it could make men endure the most brutal conditions on earth. But then, imagine if that same place and the memory of it became so terrible that the human mind, in a collective act of self-preservation, simply chose to forget. This is not a story of a ghost town. This is the story of a town that became a ghost in the minds of the men and women who built it. Welcome to Kino City, 1898. Welcome to the town that erased itself from memory. Our story begins not with a whisper, but with a roar, the Klondike Gold Rush. By 1898, the easy pickings along the creeks near Dawson City were gone, staked by thousands. But the dream of gold is a fever, and it drives men to look beyond the horizon, into the harshest, most unforgiving landscapes. One of those men was a prospector named John One-Eyed Kino, a man as tough as the land he explored. Pushing further into the Ogilvie Mountains, into a region of jagged peaks and deep, silent valleys, he found it. Not a rich stream, but the Mother Lode itself, a vein of silver-rich galena so pure it gleamed like a malicious smile in the rock. He staked his claim, and the word, as it always does, spread like wildfire. But this was a different kind of fire. It didn't attract the hopeful masses of the Klondike. It drew a different breed, a harder, more desperate, more solitary kind of man. To get to Kino City, you didn't just travel, you endured. You battled the choking dust of summer, the swarms of black flies that could drive a man to madness, and the winter that descended with a fury that seemed almost personal. Temperatures would plummet to 60 below, and the darkness, the winter darkness, was absolute, a physical weight that pressed down on the soul. The town that grew was a ramshackle collection of log cabins and canvas tents, clinging to the side of the mountain like lichen on a stone. There was no law here, no church, no women or children in the early days. It was a world of men, their faces weathered into leather masks, their eyes perpetually scanning the ground for the next glittering sign. And for a while, the mountain gave up its treasure. Claims were staked, mines were sunk deep into the permafrost, and rough silver bricks began to stack up in the company shacks. Men like Lars Hennig, a silent Swede who owned the Lucky Strike claim, and Dublin Mike O'Rourke, whose laugh could fill a saloon, became local legends. They built a life of sorts. A saloon called the Silver Slipper opened, its windows fogged with the heat of bodies and the smell of raw whiskey. The sound of an out-of-tune piano fought against the wind. For a brief moment, in the perpetual struggle for survival, there was a semblance of community. They were bound together not just by greed, but by the shared understanding of the immense, silent power of the land that surrounded them. A land that never felt truly conquered, only temporarily tolerated. The first sign was subtle. It was the winter of '99, a winter so brutal it felt like the mountain itself was trying to expel them. Miners, usually solitary figures, began to report a strange feeling of being watched in the deep tunnels, a sensation so acute they would turn, pickaxe raised, to find only the damp, dark rock. Then came the sounds, faint, echoing whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, just on the edge of hearing. At first it was dismissed as the wind whistling through fissures or the tinnitus born of constant drilling. But the stories persisted. A man named Abner Hayes swore he saw a figure standing at the end of his tunnel, a man shaped from shadow and shifting rock dust. When he advanced, the figure was gone, leaving only the scent of ozone and cold stone. Then the hallucinations began. They didn't happen to everyone, and never in a group. They were intensely personal, private horrors. One miner, shoveling ore, suddenly found himself standing in a sun-drenched wheat field in Iowa, the smell of his mother's pie thick in the air. He dropped to his knees, weeping, only for the vision to vanish, leaving him kneeling in the frozen muck of his claim. Another, Mike O'Rourke himself, was in the Silver Slipper when he suddenly couldn't recognize the faces of his friends. They were strangers, their features shifting and melting like wax. He stumbled out into the snow, screaming that he didn't know who he was. These weren't drunken visions, they were vivid, terrifying breaks with reality, and they were becoming more frequent.
The event that broke the town's spirit was the disappearance of the Larson brothers. They were working a claim high on the ridge, two quiet Finns who kept to themselves. When they failed to show up for supplies for over a week, a group of men went to check on them. They found the cabin door unlocked. Inside, the stove was cold. 2 bowls of half-eaten stew sat on the table, frozen solid. Their mining tools were neatly stacked by the door, but the brothers were gone. A search party scoured the area for days, but they found no tracks leading away from the cabin in the fresh snow. It was as if the 2 men had simply been plucked from existence. The official report would later list them as missing, presumed dead. But in the hushed tones of the saloon that night, another theory took hold. The mountain hadn't taken their bodies, it had taken them back. Panic, cold and insidious, began to replace the fever for gold. The hallucinations spread. Men would wake up in their bunks unable to recall their own names. They would stare at their own hands, their own reflections in a bucket of water, with no sense of ownership. It was a mass creeping amnesia, a disillusion of the self. The very memories that made them who they were, their past lives, their loves, their reasons for coming here, were being scoured away by some unseen force. The community they had built shattered. Trust evaporated. How could you trust a man who might not remember you, or even himself, from one moment to the next? The social contract, already thin in this raw frontier, dissolved completely.
The final exodus was not a coordinated flight, but a frantic, individual scattering. It was triggered by what happened to Lars Hennig. He was found sitting on a stump outside his mine, the Lucky Strike, now silent. He was perfectly calm, but his eyes were empty. When a concerned miner approached him, Lars looked up and asked in a voice devoid of all emotion, "What is this place? Who are you?" He had no memory of his name, his claim, or the fortune in silver buried in the mountain behind him. He was a blank slate. That was the final proof. The mountain wasn't just claiming their lives, it was claiming their very identities. Within a week, Kino City was empty. Men abandoned their claims, their tools, their hard-won silver, leaving everything exactly as it was. They fled, not from the cold or the hardship, but from the terrifying void where their memories used to be. The trail out of the Ogilvy Mountains that season was not a path of hopeful prospectors, but a ragged line of broken men. They didn't speak of what had happened. There were no tall tales, no boasts of narrow escapes. They walked with their heads down, their eyes fixed on the path ahead, as if afraid to look back for fear that the very act of remembering the place would summon the emptiness once more. They arrived in Dawson City not as conquering miners, but as refugees from a silent war. Their pockets sometimes heavy with raw silver, but their souls frighteningly light.
In Dawson, the saloons were loud and bright, filled with a cacophony of 1,000 untouched memories. But the men from Kino sat in the corners, nursing their drinks, their silence a stark contrast to the boisterous energy around them. When asked about their strike, about the fabled silver veins of Kino City, they would simply shake their heads. Their faces would go blank, a shudder falling behind their eyes. "Don't recall," they'd mumble. "Nothing up there but rock and cold." It was a lie, but it was a lie their minds had insisted upon, a protective barrier against a truth too terrible to hold. The authorities took notice. A mounted policeman, Sergeant Malcolm Fletcher, a man built on facts and procedure, was dispatched to investigate the abandoned settlement. His report, filed in the spring of 1900, is a masterpiece of bureaucratic confusion. He found a town frozen in time, a pot still simmering on a cold stove in the Silver Slipper. Ledgers lay open on desks, the ink faded, but the entries clear, detailing thousands of dollars in silver shipments. Personal effects, photographs of loved ones, letters from home, a child's carved toy that must have belonged to one of the later arrivals, were left in cabins as if their owners had just stepped out for a moment.
But it was the lack of chaos that was most disturbing. There were no signs of a struggle, no violence, no pestilence. It was an orderly evacuation of one's own mind. Fletcher interviewed the few former residents he could track down.
He found Lars Hennig working as a dishwasher in a Skagway hotel, a man with no past. When shown a deed to the Lucky Strike claim with his own name on it, he stared at it with genuine bewilderment. "Must be another fella," he said softly. Same name. I've never been a miner. Dublin, Mike O'Rourke was found in a Seattle flophouse, a shadow of the man he once was. He could remember his childhood in Ireland, the boat to New York, but the years between 1898 and 1899 were a complete and total blank. He described it as a hole in my life. Fletcher's final report concluded that a shared psychological malady, likely induced by extreme isolation, malnutrition, and the peculiar atmospheric conditions of the high altitude, was the cause. It was a neat, logical explanation he could put in a file. But in his personal diary, an entry dated June 15, 1900, reveals his true feelings. He wrote, "I've investigated murders, stampedes, and claims of witchcraft, but I've never felt a dread like the one in that empty town. It is not what is there, it is what is missing. It is as if the soul of the place has been scooped out, and it has taken the memories of every man who lived there with it. I stayed 2 nights, and upon waking this morning for a few terrifying seconds, I could not recall my wife's face."
What could have caused such a thing? Modern theories abound. Some point to ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on damp grains and can cause convulsions and hallucinations, the same culprit behind the Salem witch trials. Perhaps a shipment of tainted flour made its way to the isolated community. Others suggest a slow leak of carbon monoxide or other natural gases from the mines, an invisible poison that slowly asphyxiated not their bodies but their cognitive functions, targeting the hippocampus, the very seat of memory. But the local Han First Nation people, who had long avoided that specific mountain ridge, have a different explanation. Their elders called the area Yendata, which translates roughly to the place where spirits drink. They believed that the mountain was home to ancient, non-human entities that did not feed on flesh or blood, but on the essence of experience, on memory itself. To them, the prospectors were not cursed or punished. They were simply a feast. The miners, with their intense greed, their powerful hopes, and their bitter regrets, had provided a rich and concentrated source of sustenance for these primordial beings. The hallucinations were not a symptom of poisoning, but the feeling of one's very life being siphoned away, the flickering of a candle flame as it is consumed.
The legacy of Kino City is a haunting one. The town was eventually repopulated by a new wave of miners in the 1910s, men who knew the stories but dismissed them as superstition. They mined the silver for decades, and the modern-day hamlet of Kino City still exists. But the original town site, the one from the rush of '98, is still there too, just a little ways up the hill. The logs of the old cabins are slumped and gray, returning to the earth. If you walk there today, amidst the whispering aspens and the constant wind, you might feel it, a profound and unsettling silence. It's the sound of a place that knows how to forget and knows how to make others forget. It's the sound of a memory not just fading, but being actively erased.
Imagine the storm. Not a gentle rain, but a biblical tempest, the kind that seems to tear at the very fabric of the world. The Atlantic, in the dead of winter, 1900. The sea isn't water anymore. It's a churning, black chaos of foam and fury. And in the heart of this maelstrom, a single point of light is supposed to be burning. A beacon on a remote, jagged island. A promise of safety for the men braving the waves. But on this night, on the Flannan Isles, that light has gone out. And the 3 men tasked with keeping it are gone. Vanished. As if the storm itself reached out a watery hand and plucked them from the face of the earth. The door to their sturdy lighthouse was locked from the inside. The table was set for a meal. A chair lay overturned on the floor. And the only thing more terrifying than the storm that raged outside
was the perfect, inexplicable silence that remained within. Our story begins not with the mystery, but with the men. 3 ordinary men with ordinary lives who took on an extraordinary and lonely job. First was James Duckett, a 43-year-old seasoned lighthouse keeper, a family man with a wife and children on the mainland. He was the principal keeper, steady, reliable, a man who knew the sea and respected its power. Then Thomas Marshall, the second keeper, a man perhaps more passionate, more intense, prone to moments of profound awe and terror at the forces he witnessed. And finally, Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper, a seasoned mariner himself, filling in at the last minute. He was a stout, strong man, known for his courage and his familiarity with the brutal waters of the Outer Hebrides.
Their home for weeks at a time was Island Moor, the largest of the Flannan Isles. These are not gentle green islands. They are 7 jagged teeth of black gneiss rock, jutting from the ocean about 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis. The Gaelic name for them is Na Ilanan Flannoch, a name that some say hints at the legendary Saint Flannan, but which older, darker whispers in the local pubs link to something else entirely, something older than saints. The cliffs rise 200 feet almost straight out of the water, and at the top, perched like a defiant white sentinel, was the lighthouse. It was a marvel of Victorian engineering, a 75-foot tower of stone built to withstand the worst the Atlantic could throw at it. But it wasn't just the waves the builders had to contend with. The very act of building it, from 1895 to 1899, was plagued with tragedy. Men and supplies were swept away. The locals on Lewis would shake their heads and mutter. They called Island Moor the Green Island for the strange, rich grass that grew there, a grass that no sheep would ever graze upon. They said the island was cursed, that it was a place for the Focin, malevolent spirits of Celtic myth, or that it was a gateway to Tir Fortuin, the land under the waves. The keepers, practical men of the age of steam and steel, likely dismissed such stories as superstitious nonsense. But on an island so remote, so battered by the elements, with the wind screaming like a banshee through the crags, it was perhaps harder to dismiss them completely. The last normal contact with the outside world was on December 15, 1900. The steamer Arctur, passing by on its route from Philadelphia to Leith, noted that the Flannan Isles light was burning bright and clear. All was well. The next 2 weeks, the weather was foul, as it often is in December. A relentless series of storms made passage to the islands impossible. It wasn't until December 26th, St. Stephen's Day, that the relief vessel, the Hesperus, could finally set out from Briskleet on Lewis. Aboard was Captain Jim Harvey, the superintendent, and a replacement keeper, Joseph Moore. The sea was still heavy, the sky a leaden gray. As the Hesperus approached Island Moor, the men on deck scanned the tower, expecting to see a flag raised, a sign of welcome. There was nothing, no flag, no activity. And as they drew closer, a cold knot of dread began to form in Joseph Moore's stomach. The landing crane, which should have been ready to receive them, was in its resting position. The usual boxes of provisions for transfer were nowhere to be seen. The island looked utterly deserted. Captain Harvey gave 3 long, mournful blasts on the ship's whistle, the sound swallowed by the vast, empty landscape. No response. He then sounded the steam siren, a desperate, shrieking call that echoed off the cliffs. Only the gulls answered. Something was terribly wrong. Joseph Moore volunteered to go ashore. The sea was still treacherous, the small boat rising and falling violently as the crew rowed him towards the tiny concrete landing platform, known as the East Landing. It was a perilous operation, leaping from the boat onto the slick concrete at the precise moment a wave lifted it. He made it, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was alone on Island Moor. The path from the landing to the lighthouse was a steep, winding climb up a narrow path cut into the cliff face. Moore took it at a run, his boots slipping on the wet stone. The sense of wrongness grew with every step. The gate at the top of the path was closed. The entrance gate to the compound was closed. He rushed to the main door of the lighthouse keeper's cottage, the part of the structure attached to the tower itself. He grabbed the cold brass handle and turned.
The door was locked from the inside. Now his fear was a living thing clawing at his throat. He circled the building, finding a spare key in a hidden crevice, a secret known only to the keepers. His hand trembled as he fitted it into the lock. The door swung open with a creak. He stepped into the silence. The first thing that struck him was the cold, a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the weather outside. It was the cold of an abandoned place. The entrance hall and the kitchen were exactly as they should be, and yet profoundly wrong. The clock on the wall had stopped. The fire in the grate was long dead, nothing but a pile of gray ash. And there, in the kitchen, was the table. It was set for a meal. A chair was pushed back as if someone had just risen from it. But another chair was lying on its side on the stone floor, overturned, as if its occupant had leapt up in a sudden, violent hurry. Moore's voice, when he called out, was a thin, reedy thing in the vast silence. James? Thomas? Donald? Only the wind answered, moaning softly through the eaves. He forced himself to move, to investigate further. In the bedrooms, the keeper's personal effects were all in place. Pocket watches, pipes, journals. James Ducat's oilskin coat and boots were missing. Thomas Marshall's were still in his room. But Donald MacArthur's, his oilskin coat was hanging on its peg. A man does not go out into a December storm on Island Moor without his oilskin. It was a death sentence. Moore's mind raced, trying to piece together a scenario that made sense. He ran up the spiraling stone stairs of the lighthouse tower itself. The lamp was pristine, filled with oil, the wicks trimmed. It was ready to be lit, but the great glass panels of the lantern room were spotless. It had not been lit the night before. He descended, his footsteps echoing in the terrible quiet, and made his way back to the east landing to signal the Hesperus. He had to report the impossible. The 3 men were gone. Captain Harvey and more men came ashore. A thorough search of the tiny island began, and it was here that the first tangible clues were found, clues that only deepened the mystery. At the west landing, the scene was one of devastation. This landing was even more exposed than the east, a place where the full, untamed power of the Atlantic crashed directly onto the rocks. A box that had held mooring ropes and crane handles had been smashed to splinters. The ropes themselves were gone, torn away. And crucially, an iron railing bolted into the rock at the cliff edge was bent and twisted at a grotesque angle as if some immense force had seized it and wrung it like a wet cloth. Captain Harvey immediately formed a theory, the one that would become the official explanation: a massive freak wave. He pictured one of the keepers, perhaps Marshall, on duty at the West Landing, securing something before the storm. Another keeper, Ducat, seeing the danger from above, rushes down to warn him, leaving his coat behind in his haste. MacArthur, the sturdy occasional, seeing both in peril, rushes out from the lighthouse without even his oilskin. They are all there, trying to secure the equipment, when a wall of water 100 feet high silently rises from the sea and sweeps all 3 of them away in an instant. It was a clean, logical, terrifyingly plausible explanation. The stopped clock could have marked the moment of the catastrophe. The overturned chair, the result of MacArthur's frantic rush to the door. But there were problems. The door was locked from the inside. Who locked it after MacArthur ran out? And why would all 3 experienced keepers, men who knew the power of the sea and the particular dangers of the West Landing, be down there at once, especially in such foul weather? The lighthouse logbook, which was recovered, added another layer of eerie detail. The entries, written in Thomas Marshall's hand, told a story of growing fear in the days leading up to their disappearance. He wrote of storms so violent the men were praying. He described James Ducat as very quiet and Donald MacArthur as crying. He wrote on December 12th, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." These were the words of men under immense psychological strain. But were they real? Subsequent analysis would suggest that these dramatic entries were likely fabricated, their dates tampered with. But by whom? And why? The official investigation by the Northern Lighthouse Board concluded, predictably, that the men had been swept away by a wave while attending to the equipment at the West Landing. It was an act of God, a tragic accident. But the public, and the generations that followed, were not satisfied. The locked door, the set table, the overturned chair, the stopped clock. It was a crime scene without a crime, a ghost story written in the language of fact. And so, the older stories, the ones the Victorian engineers had ignored, came rushing back. The locals nodded knowingly. They spoke of the Fachan, a monstrous, one-legged, one-armed, one-eyed creature of Celtic myth that could stir the seas into a frenzy. They whispered of the Phantom of the Seven Hunters, a spectral being seen on the islands. Some even spoke of something more sinister, a giant seabird, a harbinger of doom, whose cry could drive men mad. Had the keepers, in their isolation, fallen prey to some shared madness, some folie à trois that caused them to turn on one another in a fit of primal fear? Or had they, in a moment of collective panic, chosen to end their own lives in the unforgiving sea? The evidence pointed to none of this. The most chilling theory of all is one of quiet, domestic horror. Imagine the scene. The meal is prepared, the table is set. Two men are seated, James Duckett and Donald MacArthur. Thomas Marshall is perhaps on watch in the tower. An argument breaks out. It could be about anything: the crushing loneliness, a personal slight, the constant grinding fear. It escalates. A blow is struck, a chair is overturned in the struggle. In a rage, one keeper kills the other two. And then, standing in the silence, surrounded by what he has done, the murderer is consumed by guilt and horror. He strips the bodies, carries them down to the cliffs, and throws them into the sea, ensuring they will never be found. He returns to the lighthouse. He cleans the evidence. He sets the table anew, a grotesque pantomime of normalcy. He stops the clock. And then he walks out, locking the door behind him with a spare key, and hurls himself into the waves, taking the full, terrible truth with him. It is a story as dark and cold as the waters around Isle Morrow. The Flannan Isles lighthouse was restaffed. It remains in operation to this day, an automated sentinel in the 21st century. But the mystery of December 1900 has never been solved. The three keepers, James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, are remembered on a memorial on the Isle of Lewis, their names carved in stone, their fate carved only in speculation and shadow. Did the sea take them? Did madness? Or did something else, something older than the stones of Isle Morrow, something that walks in the storm and dislikes the light, come for them that night? We are left only with the image of an overturned chair, a locked door, and the enduring, haunting silence of a light that went out.